So we've just gone over some of those features to help you differentiate bumblebees. So first of all, as I mentioned, tail colour, really important, great place to start, and banding with that as well. So just generally getting, looking kind of the colour and the pattern. It is worth noting that so the colour of the tails and the colour of those bands, the patterning, that is only on the hairs, that colour. So underneath, bumblebees are all black. So that does mean that later in the summer, later in the spring, if a bumblebee's been outside a lot, if it's you might have lost a bit of hair, maybe it's been, you know, going into lots of brambles or flowers, and it might have just lost a few clumps here and there. They get a bit raggedy towards the end of the year. They get a bit bleached sometimes as well if they've been sitting in the sun a lot. So they can look quite different sometimes later in the year because the hairs can fade and, you know, be lost and change. But at this time of year, it's quite reassuring because we're mainly dealing with fresh queens, the queens that that basically have just been hibernating because they came into existence the end of last year. They're all pretty fresh and they kind of look like they've come out of the book. They've all got the right colours and they haven't really lost any hair yet. They haven't experienced the world and been affected by it yet too much. So it's a really good time to start Bumblebee ID because they all kind of look as they would in the book, really. But it is worth being aware that later in the summer it can become very difficult, if impossible, to ID some of these species as they kind of lose those characteristic colours and markings. And anywho, next feature, legs. So as I mentioned, looking at the shape of the legs, looking at the presence or absence of pollen baskets, checking that it's not a cuckoo, that it is actually in fact a social bumblebee, whether or not it has those hairy hind legs. It's worth taking a look. And the last thing to make sure that you physically take a look at on the body of the bee is the face. So as I mentioned, the male bumblebees, facial hair can be a really good recognition. Antennae can be a good thing too to try and add to the mix. And with the garden and the Heath bumblebee, it's really important to look at the face in order to tell them apart. And the last thing to kind of consider is behaviour. So we mentioned some of that earlier, some of those behaviours which are characteristic of different castes. And if you come away with one thing today, it would be great for you to know that these are the features that you need that you need basically to look at in order to get an ID, because I don't expect everyone to remember how to identify all 8 species, remember all the characteristics off the top of the head. But if you can remember the things that you need to look at, the features that you need to take note of, take photos of, then you can figure out the rest of it afterwards. So you can feel reassured that if you take photos of all these angles, it's pretty likely that you'll be able to get an ID. So it's worth keeping that in mind. And not to be too disheartened, because I know some folks that they started their Bumblebee ID journey, and maybe they'll I don't know, take a photo or something, and they don't necessarily get an ID. But it's good to have lots of angles so that you can get those answers and you can get those species IDs. So if we're okay, the break was going to be here, but are we happy we've had our break? Yeah. Okay. So now we're quickly going to go on to the big 8, and we're just going to kind of go through them each individually and talk about some of the key characteristics. But obviously we've learned the different kind of characteristics that are going to differentiate them, which is really good. So we're going to start with the common carder bee. This is our only common ginger bumblebee that we get. It's all ginger, as you can see. I will say that these illustrations aren't necessarily the best illustrations of this particular species. As you can see here, there's a photo on the left, and basically with common carders, the key thing that really does differentiate them from other carder bees, even the not common, you know, rare species, if you would. They have black hairs on their abdomen, so it is tricky to see this. And sorry, I clicked something accidentally then. There we go. So it's really tricky to see, but here there are some darker hairs. But yeah, it's essentially that makes a common carder rather than one of the other carder bees, because they have these black hairs on the abdomen. They also have these kind of cream thorax sides, but as you can see in the queen worker male, they look pretty similar. So you'll be looking for these other characteristics we were talking about to try and tell them apart if you wanted to try and figure out what caste they are. If you wanted to find out whether it's a queen or a worker or a male. So you'll be looking at the leg. So, oh God, did that again, sorry. And so for example, in this photo here, this is a male. So it's got a teardrop shape. It's got a spur coming out here. So it is really tricky. But this is a male. But with the female, you'd be expecting that kind of triangle, shiny, maybe presence of pollen basket, etc. And then I guess telling the difference between a queen and a worker. To say you've got one that has that triangle and you're like, okay, I think it's a female. Is it a queen or a worker? You'd be looking at the size of them. So if it's massive, it's going to be a queen. If it's a lot smaller, it's going to be a worker. And also considering behavior, but it is difficult. But yes, essentially, if you see a ginger, you see a ginger bumblebee when you're out and about, it's almost certainly going to be a common carder bee. So the next one, now we're going to go on to the bumblebees with the red tails, the two common species that have red tails. So the first of these is the early bumblebee. So this species does have a bit of variation between the castes. So you can see that we've got some photos here. So we've got the queen here, and then we've got the worker and the male. So if you so they are the queens in this and the females in this species. If you find out that you've got a bumblebee with a red tail and it's got some yellow bands and it's female, it's going to be an early bumblebee pretty much, unless it's quite an uncommon species. So yeah, these guys are the only common yellow banded red tailed females. So as you can see here, the queen, she has these two quite thick bands that they're pretty healthy looking on the collar and on the abdomen. In the workers, it can be quite faint, or they can lose this. So sometimes this isn't necessarily the best. Can't necessarily see it because you've got the wings in the way here, but yeah, it's quite a faint band. And sometimes there's no band there. So sometimes you do just see a red tail and a yellow collar in the workers. The males have a lot more yellow going on. So they have a yellow face, they have a yellow, quite a thick yellow collar, yellow on the abdomen, just yellow everywhere. And they usually are some of the first males seen of the year. So the name, the early bumblebee, is a bit, it's not necessarily completely, it's a bit confusing maybe, because they're not necessarily the first bumblebees that you see of the year, but they are, in most cases, the first male bumblebees that you see of the year, because they have such a short nest cycle. I think it's only about 2 or 3 months. So they're often some of the first males that you see. So if you're starting to see lots of some really yellow bees kind of relatively early in the year, then it's a good chance it could be a male early bumblebee. So they do have a red tail, but as you can see, sometimes it can be quite small and it can be quite pale, so you can miss it if they're kind of curled under. So it's worth taking a look there and being aware of that. So the second kind of common bumblebee that has a red tail is the red-tailed bumblebee. does what it says on the tin. The queens are beautiful. They really are. They're velvety black, they're absolutely massive. Really, really gorgeous. You can see one here on the left with the male. And the work is essentially miniature versions of the queen, so that they're just the same. They don't have any yellow on them. So remember on the previous one that the workers and the queen in the early bumblebees, the females in the early bumblebee have yellow on them, but all the females in the red-tailed bumblebee are all black. So it's good to try and if you know that you've got a female, then you can tell which way it is basically. And then you have the males have a yellow face, so they're not quite as ridiculously yellow as the early bumblebee, but they've still got some yellow going on. They've got a bit of a mustache. They've got a bit of a collar and a little bit here on the base of the thorax. So yeah, you'll be looking at kind of degree of yellow. So if you've got a male, you've looked at the legs or you looked at the features and you said, okay, I'm pretty sure I've got a male red tail bumblebee with a red tail, you'll be looking at how much yellow. So in this case, you've got an amount of yellow and then you've got lots of yellow. So just trying to figure out degrees of yellow basically. Okay, excellent. So next one. Now we're moving on to our bumblebees that have white tails. So there are 5 common species. The first of these we're going to go through is the Bufftail bumblebee. Again, the queens of this are massive, really big, and they have a beautiful buff tail. So it's even though they are white-tailed species, it does look, it's kind of an off-white color. But this can be quite variable. So sometimes it can be like a very orangey white, kind of like in this picture, but sometimes it can be a white tail with kind of a thin yellow band at the top of it, like here. So it can be a bit variable, but basically if you're seeing, if you're seeing something like this and you've got basically anything other than a clear white tail, it's going to be it's a bufftail rather than the next one, which we'll go on to. The workers and the males in this species do have more kind of white tails. The males sometimes do have kind of a little bit of the kind of yellowy orange at the base. Sorry, at the top of the tail even. But yeah, they're pretty much kind of white tail. They don't have this buff color. And as I mentioned earlier, the workers in this species can't really be distinguished from the white-tailed bumblebee, which we'll be going on to in a minute, because they basically look identical in the field. But that's fine, and a lot of the recording schemes, etc. You can just record them as a buff or white-tailed worker. That's perfectly acceptable and normal practice. So in terms of the males, they look kind of fairly similar to the queen and the worker. But if we go on to the next species, which is the one that the other bumblebee that has a white tail and 2 yellow bands normally, we have the white-tailed bumblebee. So these 2 are the ones that you're likely to confuse with one another basically. So in the white-tailed bumblebee, they have a very clear white tail, properly white. You shouldn't see any bits of orange, shouldn't see any yellow. It should be a nice clear white tail. I mean, it's easy to say that, but it can be a bit tricky to tell in reality. Typically, again, it's said that they're more like a lemony yellow, whereas with the bufftail, if we go back, it's slightly more kind of orangey yellow. It's like different shades of yellow, which can be tricky to tell again. But yeah, there are some kind of slight differences there. As I said before, the workers in this species cannot be differentiated from the bufftail bumblebee, and that's fine. But the males can be, and the queens can be. So the queens, as we said, look quite different. They've got a pure white tail, whereas in the other species, they had a really orangey tail or at least a little bit of orange in the tail. And the males in this species, as you can see, they've got a lot more yellow going on, and they do have a yellow mustache, which the bufftail bumblebees don't have. And they've also got extra yellow that they didn't have before. So they've got some yellow at the bottom of the thorax, and you can see here it's just a lot of yellow, really, which this one just does not have. So yeah, if you've got a very yellow bumblebee with a white tail and it's a male, it's probably going to be a white-tail bumblebee, although in a minute we will go over another species that I find quite difficult to tell apart, but in most cases it is going to be a white-tail bumblebee. Okay, so next one in our white-tailed bumblebees round is the garden bumblebee. So as we mentioned before, this is the bumblebee that has white tail, 3 yellow bands. So again, 3 yellow bands, collar, base of the thorax, top of the abdomen, and they have a white tail. So once you have this combination, you've only got 2 options really that are common. But the garden bumblebee, Hortorum, has a horsey face, a very long face, long tongue. That's a really key feature. So if you're seeing white tail, you're seeing 3 bands, you need to look at the face. You're going to have to. So this is the other option when you're looking at a bumblebee with a white tail and 3 yellow bands. This is the Heath bumblebee. As you can see, the face much shorter. I might just go back and forth and see if you can see the difference. So long, not long, long, not long. You can see that it's quite different, the face there. They've got quite a short and stout face, whereas the other one is really quite lengthy. Now the males in the species do have yellow going on. They have yellow mustaches and they do get pretty yellow. This ID diagram it's not good. It's a shame, but it's not accurate to reality. They have yellow mustaches and they have degrees of yellow. It can be quite difficult to tell this species apart of the males with the white tail. I find it really difficult, so don't despair on that. I am trying to remember exactly what it was. It was to do with the amount of yellow on which tergites. So which is a technical term. Sorry, it's the different kind of I guess levels of the different plates on the abdomen. Basically, it gets quite technical. So I'd recommend at that point probably taking photos and trying to ask other people. Generally, I think the white-tailed bumblebee is more yellow, basically, slightly more yellow than this one. But yeah, it's tricky basically. But at least you've limited your options down, and you know you've got a boy. Yeah. So the next and the final one of our big 8 is the tree bumblebee, which we've already identified previously. So been there, done that. And this is a species that's spreading northwards. This map is not up to date. It's well up into Scotland. As I mentioned, it first appeared on the map in the early 2000s, and it's making its way up very nicely. It's doing very well in urban areas, which is great. So it's very, very, very distinctive. We haven't really seen anything else that looks that much like it. So it's if you're seeing something with a white tail, and you're not really seeing those yellow bands, you've got this nice brown patch on the thorax, then you've probably got a tree bumblebee. They can be melanistic. You can get some kind of darker ones as well, and that's quite common actually. So you can get ones that are quite dark all over, so maybe they don't have this brown patch. But if they have a white tail and they're quite dark all over, then it probably is going to be a tree bumblebee, because there aren't that many others that look like that. Let's see. And in terms of telling the casts apart, again, in this species, they all look quite similar. as you can see. So you'll be looking at those features like the legs. So you'll be looking at the legs here. So this here is a queen. She's got a lovely triangle. Can you see those hairs? The kind of copy, like the kind of I guess copying the kind of I'm trying to think the right word really, but it's, yeah, they're kind of going in like this, which is a really great feature. But yeah, you've got a lovely triangle, shiny, so you know that's going to be a female. And because of the size of this one, obviously we're not there, we're seeing a photo, that it is going to be a queen because it's big. Here we have a male on the top. So you can see here that it's more like a teardrop shape, slightly. It's not quite as triangular, at least. Yeah, but this is a male, and yeah, it's not a great trait, but I have seen it in other individuals. But sometimes with tree bumblebees, the males, they do have a bit of a mustache actually. So you can see here he does have a slightly lighter mustache, but it's very subtle. So. But yeah, and sometimes they do get a little bit of oh, getting some drawing. They do get a little bit of brown on the hips. Sometimes the males, so that it's just worth paying attention to if you're wanting to try and get it to cast. It can be helpful. But yeah, essentially, if you've got something that looks like this, it's going to almost certainly be a tree bumblebee. So we've come to the end of the kind of ID portion. So now I'm going to talk about some of the resources, because hopefully you're all excited. You want to start your Bumblebee ID journeys, and you just want to get cracking. So as we shared before, a poster, an ID guide on the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website, which covers the big 8 bumblebees. And that can be really useful if you're just starting out and you just want to see what you've got in your garden. There's also some other really great free resources out there. So if you're on Facebook, I'd really recommend joining the UK Bees, Wasps and Ants group. It's really useful to see what other people are seeing at the same time of year, because you'll all be seeing the same kinds of things. So and often because we're more northern up here in Cumbria, you'll see what everyone else is seeing down south, and then in a few weeks time, you'll start seeing it too. So it's a nice kind of I don't know, it's like preemptive, like you can see what's going to come before you've seen it. But yeah, it's a really helpful resource, and lots of people also share their photos in there, and there's lots of experts who can help with ID and stuff. So yeah, it's a really good resource. Stephen Falk's Flickr is also amazing. Stephen Falk is basically the national expert on bees, and he has a Flickr where he basically has photos of every single bumblebee, solitary bee species, many other insects as well, and he has multiple photos of those species, including kind of when they don't look as they should. So sometimes bumblebees, they don't follow the rules, and they can look a bit different to how they're supposed to in the books. Maybe they've got extra color in places you wouldn't expect it or whatever. And he has all those kind of anomalies on there as well. So if you've got something that looks a bit strange, it can be a really useful resource to check out. If you want something to kind of help with ID when you're out and about, the Blooms for Bees app is pretty good. It has a bee guide in that, so you can download that and open it up when you see a bee, and it can help you look at some of the features that we've looked at today. But generally, yeah, just taking pictures is really useful, and there's lots of platforms out there, which we'll go through in a second as well, that you can upload those images even if you don't know what it is, and people can help you find an answer. There are also some really great books and guides if you want to throw a bit of money at it. So Stephen Falk created a really amazing field guide to all bumblebees and solitary bees, so all 270 species that we have in the UK. It's a really lovely book, lots of really lovely illustrations. So if you are interested in BID, get that one because it's the best. If you're interested just in kind of bumblebees, then Bumblebee Conservation Trust also have written a book, and it covers lots of ecology and other interesting things about bumblebees too. So if you want to learn more about bumblebees, their behaviour ecology, I'd recommend that. There's also some really great pocket-sized guides as well. So they have one for the 8 common species we've gone over today, one for the 6 cuckoo bumblebee species, and also one for the 8 scarce bumblebee species too. So you can have them as these like fold-out guides. They're quite nice. So many of you will be aware, because it's in the media a lot, but wild pollinators are struggling. Well, I say it's in the media a lot. Often it's through a slightly biased lens, maybe focused on pollinators, and particularly on honeybees, which isn't necessarily accurate. But our wild pollinators are really struggling. The rate of extinction of wild pollinators is 8 times faster than that of birds, mammals, and reptiles. And a third of British wild bees and holoflies are in decline. And the future looks even bleaker, because that was a few years ago that study was done. It's thought that these alarming declines are due to loss of habitat, basically. Over the last 75 years in the UK, we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows, and it's having really quite catastrophic effects on wild pollinators. They're saying that these declines are not fully understood. We don't really know, because if we don't know where stuff is, how can we know whether it's declining, whether it's increasing, we don't have all the answers. So we've in this webinar we've been going over the beginner Bumblebee ID, but now you can utilize those skills to help improve this understanding through recording. So what is biological recording? Well, essentially, biological recording, pollinator recording, is about, so a record is a point on a map that shows where a certain species was at a certain time, and who found that. So it's essentially just these 4 pieces of information, and it can be really, really useful for a lot of reasons. As it allows us to, so these pieces of information are really important because they allow us to know where stuff is and when, and from this we can do all kinds of analyses, and kind of figure out the state of pollinators and other wildlife. Today you can start recording. It's really simple and very accessible. For the Get Cumbria Buzzing project, we've created a project on iNaturalist. And iNaturalist is a platform that anyone can get involved with. It has an app, so you can download the app, and on there you can essentially record any and all pollinators that you see out in the field, and any other wildlife too. But if you join our project, so if you type in Get Cumbria Buzzing onto iNaturalist, join our project, then your records will come directly to us, and then we can do good with those records. So first of all, if you contribute these records, with the Get Cumbria Buzzing project with Cumbria Biodiversity Data Centre, later this year, we'll be producing a Cumbria Bumblebee Atlas, Cumbria's first. And if you contribute your records, your Bumblebee records from all the, utilize all that knowledge that you now have, and to produce records via iNaturalist, your records could feature in essentially this scientific report, which is really exciting, in this publication. So and we'll be accepting records basically through the summer of 2022 for the atlas to be produced at the end of the summer, which is really exciting. If you're feeling really enthused, we do have other webinars within this series. So hopefully you'll be coming along next Thursday to our intermediate bumblebee identification webinar. And we also have another webinar on Wednesday, 23rd of March, where we'll be going into pollinator recording in a bit more detail. So all the different ways that you can get involved, and also talking a bit more about how valuable those individual records are, and the kinds of outputs that they can produce.